And we also live in a world that's post-truth. This is also a very important thing to remember. Some of these different conflicts include, of course, immigration and refugees, race, gender, class, poverty, police violence, inequality. I could name, the list could go on and on and on. And this, of course, does not even consider the national level political conflicts engulfing us recently and for the last several years. So what are we to do? That's the question. With that, I'm going to turn to our panelists, and we have a format here that's intended to just create conversation and dialogue. Each panelist is going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we're going to go to a second set of questions for another 5 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up for conversations with the audience. So for the first 20, 25 minutes, these are our questions. And I'll begin with Mark, since you're to my right. We'll work down the line. Where are you in your work and your thinking about what we should be doing in this country to move forward? And importantly, what are your thoughts on the ways we should be engaging in conflict resolution and building peace in the United States? But also, what are the big assumptions you're working with? So, you're going to put that on. Yep. Yes. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I've worked for about 32 years in the Middle East. And at the same time working with people here, bringing them there, 15 years in Syria, and the last 5 to 7 years in recovery work and empowerment work for mostly women and children, Syrian women and children in Jordan and Turkey. At the same time, I'm a resident here. My family come out of Eastern Europe and out of survival of the destruction of European Jewry, and I'm very conscious of the warning signs. And so we all know that there are massive warning signs here as this strange empire that has bequeathed to the world many pro-social works that actually supported my work is at the same time declining into the very nightmares that we were confronting overseas. My thinking is very controversial at this point, because what I've done in the last few years is withdraw into a psychological approach to healing and change and political empowerment. And the reason I did that, one of the reasons, was because we came over and we were in the middle of a genocide, and we were watching people who were completely emotionally break down, and there was absolutely no funds for that. There's no funds for psychosocial healing. There's no funds for what it is to politically empower women who have been raped and lost 40 members of their family and can't bury their brother. And yet we're saying, oh, let's talk about citizenship. So that work catapulted me into the fact that we have to rethink what is the psychological strength and fortitude and resources that make people into change makers, that make people resilient, and that also make people into those who can handle more than one narrative at the same time. Because to watch these women who used to be enemies, Sunni, Shia, feminist, Muslim Brotherhood, all sitting in the same room caring for each other, because of the circumstances, was transformative to what creates power, what creates agency. And I think that, and this is where it's going to get controversial, after a lot of deep thought, I'm keenly interested in those who feel grievances in this country. Because I've been working with enemies so long, people who actually hated my people, I'm very comfortable with racists and with bigots. I'm very comfortable with people who have a conception in the brain that's hardwired to hate for somebody. And what I've discovered is that I've gone back into neuroscience and into the ways in neuroplasticity. And I started to discover that empathy is not as good as the left and progressives for a couple of hundred years have thought it is. On the contrary, empathy is debilitating ultimately to the brain and to the body. It creates a lot of cortisol. It ends up in the amygdala. It makes you withdraw. It makes you depressed. It makes you angry. Ultimately, it's exhausting. Whereas the research on compassion, which is in a different part of the brain, the joy and the joy of others, opens up your heart to the stranger, opens your heart up to the enemy. And it just transforms your entire health system, which makes you more pro-social, more creative, and I believe more rational. Because it's the same part of the prefrontal cortex that's activated by compassion is also the key place of reasoning, and the key place that contradicts the amygdala and the violence production there. So what I'm looking for is for the progressives of the world who generally, to be prejudiced for a moment, mostly progressives have a deep moral conscience on what should be, a deep sense of abstract principles that are the basis of the human rights revolution of the past few hundred years. And at the same time, there's a curious obsession with making people scared to death, angry, afraid of what's coming. And even though there are good reasons to do that, it's very clear from Viktor Frankl's work to Little Anne Frank to many others that the true resilience is those who make you love, not those who make you hate. That's how we did our work in Syria. That's how we countered the Salafists from Saudi, the Muslim Brotherhood from Qatar, the killers from Iran and Assad, all conspiring to destroy these women and children. And then Russia and America behind, etc. And the only thing that gave them was the love they had for each other. So what I'm suggesting is that we start to focus our reaching out to the white community. And it is not all whites. And on the contrary, it's about 50% that are voting the wrong way, maybe 60%. And then there's only 6 or 7%. I'm fascinated by the extremists because there's a lot of evidence of conversion stories through love and care. And I can't go into the details now, but I'm very interested in whether we can become more creative and more rational about what it is to convert this society back away from demagoguery, which is an ever-present possibility in human nature. Stanley Milgram proved that a long time ago. No one is immune to the power of obedience and copying of leaders. But I think that the progressives of the last few hundred years can go back to Hutchinson and Shaftesbury and many others who understood the power and importance of what I call compassionate reasoning. The combination of compassion and reason that actually in situations of war from Somalia to Damascus, women tend to excel in emergency circumstances, which is very interesting. So I want to explore that. That's what I'm working on. That's what I'm thinking about to do in the United States, and I'm making my quiet inroads into some very conservative circles. But I want help and discussion and debate on how we can do this. How can we go through this process of conversion before we have to suffer a lot of death? I do believe history is going in the right direction, even here. But we don't want the suffering. We don't want the needless death as people learn a hard lesson. That's it. Thank you. I pass the mic.
I'm Paula Green. I'm talking into a mic that doesn't work. I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry for the people in the corner that I can't see you very well. I'm an international peace builder now working in the United States. And I find myself in the odd position of being an advocate for U.S. peace building because I haven't done it for 30 years. But since the election, my life has shifted, and a U.S. project fell into my lap at the time that I was stepping down from my other professional roles, and this is where it's taken me. I started Karuna Center for Peacebuilding in Amherst, Mass. about 25 years ago, and I've been a professor at the School for International Training for almost all of that 25 years, teaching generations of master students and running a very popular summer institute called Contact. And in that time, I probably worked in 25 or 30 of the world's hotspots and learned a great deal. And just as I was wrapping that up, the election happened. And I felt called to put my energy here. It seemed like the important and the right thing to do. So what I want to talk to you about this morning is us as AFP. We're peace builders. We're working all over the world. What's our work here? As Americans, what's our responsibility here? If we're not Americans, what's our responsibility for you all from other countries to intervene here as we have intervened in many other countries? We're not above needing other people. We need other people desperately because other people have lived through some of these conflicts, have seen the rise of fascism and oligarchy, and can be helpful to us as we struggle with the very frightening and threatening dynamics happening in our own country. So I want to call that to everybody. I don't know what else it's going to take for us to wake up to our responsibility here. If the Kavanaugh hearings weren't enough and the rallies going on across the country were not enough, maybe the pipe bombs are the final wake-up call for us. That we can't abandon our international work, but we can't we can't rest while this is going on in our country. And we have such skills in this organization. There's so much talent here. We know conflict analysis, and we know interventions, and we know reconciliation, and we know evaluation methods, and we know how to run groups and how to develop long-term, multi-pronged activities that matter. And we can't do it other places and not do it here. I think not now, not with in such dire circumstances. So that's, as I say, it's an odd thing for me to be saying because I wasn't here until 2 years ago. I was focused in other parts of the world, although I lived here. We also can offer historical perspectives. We've seen this in other countries. We've also studied history. And we have colleagues who are living through takeovers of their governments. And we can learn from them to see what they've done, what kind of interventions have worked. How do we turn a ship this big around to go in a different direction? How do we develop a more inclusive tent? Because we know that so many of the grievances are about exclusion. People have been feeling so left out. The average white working class male is making the same thing that he made 42 years ago. But those dollars aren't worth very much. No wonder people are aggrieved. I've been working in eastern Kentucky, and I'm going to talk about that this afternoon because I'm getting a prize very sweetly, a Melanie Greenberg Prize for doing this domestic work. And I've been working with a community in Kentucky, eastern Kentucky, in coal country. And they're so unemployed. And they're so driven into the opioid crisis because of the unemployment. And we heard about dignity. These people have no dignity left. It's been stripped of them. And we know what happens when people have no dignity is what Donna talked about in the earlier session. So our tent has to be inclusive of these kinds of people because otherwise they're turning against us, which is what's happened in the past years. And I think we can't allow that to happen. We also understand about structural violence and secondary violence. And when I think about these folks with the opioid epidemic and the domestic violence and the despair, the suicides, all the things that are happening, it's secondary violence. It's not their fault. We shouldn't be blaming people for that. We should be helping people understand that the unjust social structures result in very unskillful personal behaviors. And that's something else that I think we have a responsibility to try to turn around because those things are so connected. We're also very good at coalition building. And in this divided world, groups of activists are alienated from each other. And what skills can we bring from our work overseas to help group A's, B, and C be in better relationship with each other? To understand that we're set up to fight for the crumbs, one against the other, instead of uniting to try to create some justice for all of us. I have assumptions that Doug asked about. My first assumption is we're in this for the long haul. I think what we're experiencing didn't start with the election and isn't going to end with a shift of elections. I think we have a multi-year, multi-generational problem on our hands, which is why we need a lot of deliberate strategy. The conservatives have been extremely successful in a long-term planned campaign to take over the institutions of government, the academy, the think tanks, the courts, and more. And we, with all our skills and ideas, haven't been nearly as clever. And I think we have to try to remedy that a little bit and see if we can get to the point where we can make more contributions to sustain the kind of society we all believe in. And I think we also need to learn from other industrialized countries which have done very well in finding new paths for blue-collar workers that continue to give them dignity so that they're not quite as stressed out as people are in this country and don't turn against the liberal agenda, don't turn against the immigrants as much because their needs have been taken care of. And I think if we can create more inclusivity, which is what I've been doing in this project that I'll talk about later, this Kentucky project, and we'll be doing with another project on race that I'm starting now that I'll also talk about later. I think if we can do those things and bring more people in, using our skills and finding ways for them to express themselves constructively, we will help to contribute to a turning. And so I throw that challenge out, especially to all of us here at AFP, because there's so much wisdom and capacity in this room that I hope will engage.
Thank you. My name is David Ragland, and the program lists that I'm the co-director of the Truth Telling Project, and I'm not. I was, right? I am. That's not the truth. I'm the Senior Bayard Rustin Fellow at the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and over the last, I would say, 5 years or so, if not longer, I'll speak specifically around my work since Ferguson. And I'm from the Ferguson community, and of course, Mike Brown was killed in August 9th, 2014. And when he was killed, I helped to start the Truth Telling Project with other community activists, and we began really interested in truth and reconciliation. And a lot of people wanted to talk because there's this community, among others, very interested in the notion of truth and reconciliation. And it became apparent really soon in Ferguson that many of the people in the community weren't necessarily interested in the notion of truth and reconciliation. It wasn't that they weren't interested, it was that the notion of reconciliation was often put to us as forgiveness, right? Forgive those who have harmed you, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's extremely important for healing to forgive. And healing has always remained, forgiveness has always remained something that I've been deeply interested in. But I also think it's a political act. Forgiveness is a political act. And one of the restorative justice practitioners that I work with, her student was Kamani Gray, was killed by the NYPD. And she would run these restorative justice circles and healing circles for her students, and she would ask, would you like to bring a police officer into the circle? And their continued response was no, because every time someone was killed by the police, we continue to be re-traumatized. And so similarly in Ferguson, people felt that constant re-traumatization over every slight, over every microaggression, like all of the things kind of build on and add up. And so this notion of forgiveness and even truth and reconciliation was important and a goal that we want to work forward. But the community that I worked with to tell their stories and record them for not just archive, but to claim their own stories, they wanted to tell their truth and they wanted people to hear it. And then over the course of even more time, over the last few years, I began to think even more that the midpoint between truth and reconciliation must be reparations. Especially if we're talking about healing and if we're talking about dealing with issues or grievances, and I wouldn't even call it grievances, I think that's too slight of a word to talk about genocide and talk about slavery, but not just, people who are descendant from white people who benefited and used and bought and sold and insured slaves. But if you're a white person in this country, you have benefited from slavery and its legacy. And this is what our fields and our communities have to be talking about. And I'll give you a couple of examples. A report by ProPublica called The Color of Debt described how debt collectors are more likely to go after black folks for debt, leaving their white colleagues. A report recently by the Center for Investigative Journalism has described how black and brown people are less likely to get mortgages, and they've used banks have actually used the Fair Housing Act, the civil rights era legislation, to lead gentrification over the last 2 decades. So if you're white, you can even have worse credit than me, less cash on hand, I'm less likely to get a mortgage. And this is part of a continuing legacy. But let's talk about police violence even. All right, the notion of epistemic injustice or just looking at injustice on the surface, there's a direct correlation between black people, brown people, but particularly black people getting killed by the police or even harassed by the police, and white privilege when it comes to police. I'm saying there is a direct relationship. So what do good white people owe is the question. And I think, when we think about this broader conversation, I often think about the notion of scarcity and abundance, as my sister Adrienne Marie Brown put forward in the book Emergent Strategies. How do we think about, I think the reason why we sort of experience, black folks, women of color in particular, experience so much economic violence and physical violence and abuse is in part because there's the view of justice, or the way that justice, liberty, goods are distributed, is based on a framework of moderate scarcity. This country is based on the notion that there has to be winners and losers. Who is it easier to be a loser? Black, brown, right? Who is it easier to be a winner? Who can we most likely create a narrative around for being successful? And so I think, what does a framework of abundance look like? What does it mean to actually heal one of the original debts, right? One of the original founding sins. And until we actually deal with some of our original founding sins, we won't move forward. And we keep asking, how do we deal in this particular era, right? Do we deal with poor white men who feel, harmed in this particular environment? And I don't want to mock that. But is it harm, or is it like I no longer have the right to abuse women or to take advantage of poor black folks around me? Because my father grew up in Tennessee picking cotton, migrated to St. Louis. And the poor white folks in his community could do anything to them. To be black was to have arbitrary violence wielded against you at any point in time by any white person. And I'm not saying we shouldn't deal with them, because even poor white folks, that's in part the way the system, has worked to bring, white men closer to elite white folks, right? If race then is the proxy for class. And so I think that there's lots of work to do here, but I think we have to look to some of our original sins of this country. And how do we go forward with that? Not deal with other things, but how do we do this and?
Thank you. When I saw the title, I thought we were going to have a Festivus party. I wanted to see the poll of grievances. But I'm going to talk really loud. Okay. Yeah, it was funny. I'm going to say it again. So I thought when I saw the title, we were going to have a Festivus party. Yes, Seinfeld. All right. The wall of grievances. We'll have that after. I think we had an interesting panel discussion on the phone, and a lot of things came up. And I think that is where I want to continue from there. So we just had a discussion on dignity. And so I think what I would like to talk about, and I think where where the country, a lot of the problems that are coming up, of people want to talk about, is the dignity of being a woman, or the dignity of a living wage, or the dignity of being of migration, or the dignity of being black. Those dignities are the cultural violences and the structural violences that we don't discuss. The dignity of getting along is really a privilege of people with power. The dignity of people without power lies in justice. And that's really the crux of this. We can look from our learnings in, Palestine and Israel. And I just say that, like, there's no more garbanzo beans in the world. Like, nobody wants to make hummus anymore together. Jews and Israelis and Palestinians making hummus, I don't see a peace process out of that. But that was, that has been what people have tried to attempt to bring peace. I think Palestinians want a house, and then we can make, hummus in their house if you want. But I think we can bring that learning here to the United States, that there's structural violence that's not being addressed. And so I'll say the word white supremacy. I think the decentering of white supremacy or whiteness in the United States is really what will help us carry the conversation forward. And I think we have an assumption that we're on the right path. I'm gonna, well, I think this is like the radical part of the panel, but I'm gonna agree with you that I think that I don't even know if we're on the right path. I think we need to stop, and I think we need to add some tools to our toolkit if we're gonna talk about doing peace in the United States, like a power analysis, which organizers and activists use, where we can just see who's in power. There's this assumption in peace building that there's a neutrality, right, in people. So there's the neutral, you have two sides and you bring them together and we're gonna talk. But if you're gonna bring a domestic violence victim and you're gonna bring the abuser together, there's a power imbalance. And so often when you approach these dialogues, you need to raise the power of each to be equal, and then you can have an equal dialogue. And so it's funny, as I'm saying this, people of color are nodding, people that don't agree with me are shaking their head. So I know this is a big issue, and we were actually gonna do a grounding even after, because this affects our own lives and our own hearts, because this is about our own identity, our own country. So I just wanna name that too, that this is something that's part of our own lives. Who am I and why do I care about this? So my family, we came as refugees from Romania. We fled our country to come to this country, and we had the luck of being white immigrants. Many migrants that are coming right now in the caravan and many that are here do not have the luck of being white. But as we were able to enter into white spaces, I knew that this culture in this place was not made for me. Maybe some even Jewish Americans feel that, right? There's a cultural difference. But that centering of whiteness is what we felt really soon, is that this place was not made for me. Time, logistics, when you get places, what you do, how you work, all of that was not made for people that are not white. And so that constant feeling of grievances by people of color the structural violence have been for many, many years. I think what's happening now is that structural violence that was under the surface is coming up. It's always been there. It's just now we're seeing it. So now it's becoming direct violence, or the cultural violence. In California, that's where I'm from, we had a big campaign about not having multilingual ATMs. Like, why are people, like, white people didn't want more than English on the ATM. I mean, that was something to fight for. So, because that was a cultural violence, right? The centering of whiteness, the centering of the English language was so important that it was detracting from them. So I would say that when we talk about, bringing like white people up to this conversation, first I say it's not my ministry, and God bless you, and I hope I do think the decentering of that is gonna help us actually get farther in the conversation, and that's what I would add to that. What we do in our work, and I'll just share a little bit of how we do that, right? How do you decenter that? So there's spaces in this country, like the borders, or like detention centers, migration centers that are made to be violent, right? They're dehumanizing locations, and even many other places. But what we've done with Activate Labs is we've gone into these centers and we've actually taken space by people who are silenced, who are invisible. So we make the unseen seen. So at the border, when the first, I think it was the second migrant caravan came to the Tijuana border, We set up, in the middle of the Chaparral, we set up a big, we call it rapid response creative trauma healing space. And we just set up a big space, the size of this or more, of this stage, where kids were doing art. And they wanted us to be corralled inside of this tent camp. And we said, no, we're gonna take up space on the sidewalk so you could see them, you could see the kids. There was a lot of media there. And the police, this is in Mexico, you know, the police and the authorities were saying, no, you can't, you're blocking and all this. No. And I told them, listen, we're gonna dance, okay? I'm gonna move forward, you're gonna move us back. Or I'm gonna move forward, you're gonna move us back. If you wanna dance with us, let's dance. Because these are kids, we can't stop them. But this idea of taking up space for people that are unseen is how we shift this power and how we shift the power dynamic. We can do that in many things, as far as who's on panels. We could do that in who gets to speak at conferences. The shifting of power, who gets to talk, I think can help us as peace builders, is to make space also, is to step down and let somebody that has personally experienced this trauma to lead these stories. I think that's another aspect that in the academic or in the professional peace building world that needs to be addressed. There's a lot of very experienced peace builders that are not white that do not get the same opportunity as peace builders that are white. Can you raise your hand if you agree? Okay, so I think that's a big issue. So that's an internal conversation for sure. But the external conversation is how we deal in this world. I think there's a lot of things we can repent of in our community and do better. But I think also in our country, there's a lot of things we could do better. I think we're gonna have that conversation, so I'll pass.
Thank you. So we're gonna, I do wanna make sure we save enough time for conversation. We had planned to do some sticky note exercises, but this room is really crowded. So I think the best thing what we're gonna do is I'm gonna pose the question to the audience, then we're gonna have, panelists are gonna talk, just say a couple words, and you're gonna be thinking, so we don't have that awkward, like, nobody says anything for the first 30 seconds. So the question that the audience, you all have to think of right now, right? And imagine you're doing sticky boards, but just, do it on your, your notes. Based on your lives as peace builders, our lives, your experiences, what can you be doing, right? That's the question. And in very importantly, in light of what the panelists have been talking about. Now, as this is our little lightning round, as the audience thinks, it sounds to me that that we need to be a little more creative in how we think about how we address these challenges. So I would like just to pass this microphone again back for 1 minute or 2 minutes of reflections of what kind of, maybe like where are we in this conflict cycle, in this conflict? I mean, we're really good at analyzing conflicts, so where are we in this conflict? Power analysis and so forth, right? Structural violence, all these things that we think about. And how can we be creative in light of our understanding of where we are?
I think, and I think we were asking this question because I said something and you guys are like, what? I think we are in the grievance stage, and by that I mean, I think people that have been harmed and hurt by this system need to speak out, and it's not our time to be like, okay, but can you just forgive? But can you forgive? That's not the time right now. I think it's the time to let people have grievances, to air them, to be heard, to be seen, to shift that power, because as empathy gets you tired, so does anger gets you tired. So I think that cycle will change. How to be creative in it? Well, I think there's a lot of creativity in that because those are voices we haven't heard yet. Those are ideas we have not yet heard yet. I mean, I want to learn everything that people that have not been seen or heard in this field and in our country have to say and think. I mean, I want them to lead. That would be amazing, right? Like imagine a whole nother layer that we haven't even seen yet. How to be creative, I'll tell you one thing we do is I make these posters, which a plug, they're all for sale outside. But and we hang them up and we bring them to our protests and to the marches that we've seen around the country. And the reason I wanted to do that is because many times, for example, in California we have this big movement against sanctuary cities, where a lot of alt-right groups are coming to our city council meetings and causing havoc. I mean, the most violence I've ever seen in my life. Your life threatened, people giving you death threat, like right in front of your face, and the police are just standing and looking at you. And so it's insanity, actually, and you can see it online because they do everything and record you and then put it on to build their YouTube channels. So this is happening in many cities in Orange County, California, where I'm from. I think like 25 of the 34 cities in Orange County have said that they don't want sanctuary laws. And so that gets, the immigrant community, which is a huge community, gets them really angry. So, they're saying F Trump, and I said, look, what if we just shift that narrative and we say we are sanctuary? Like, we are going to decide to be sanctuary whether 6 people that were elected by some people in this city say we're sanctuary or not. What does it mean to be sanctuary socially, culturally, spiritually? What does that mean? And to shift it. So then I bring my megaphone and we just yell out, we are sanctuary. And everybody's yelling out, we are sanctuary. So we take over that space for peace as opposed to more violence.
Dopeness, this is a good question. What can peace builders do? Sounds like, what can white people do? I would say peace builders work for justice. Peace is not possible without justice, but I would also ask, how can we begin to view the world and our problems and concerns and possibilities from a viewpoint of abundance as opposed to scarcity? When we talk about things like reparations and helping other people, not I don't have enough, but with all of my privileges and opportunities that my skin color has given me, because we see, mediocre white men like Brett Kavanaugh pushed toward the Supreme Court. How do we actually give back? I would encourage some very practical things. We have on November the 15th a webinar on spirituality and reparations. So follow me on Twitter at the Raglan page, and you'll see a link to register for the webinar. On October 31st, we're launching a grassroots reparations campaign. And what we'll be asking is white people to tithe. White institutions will be asking philanthropists and funders to think very differently about how you fund Black and brown grassroots-led organizations. If you are working on a project and you're a white person coming into a community of color, step back. When you go somewhere, there's always someone who knows the conflict better than you do. Provide resources to them to lead their own conflict. And we wonder why the people there don't actually care about this initiative that I'm doing. I found in my work, when I work with people and I am connecting with an initiative or connecting with what they actually want to do, it's more success.
I want to start with responding to the sanctuary thing that Monica mentioned with a story around creativity. I'm part of a community where we have somebody in sanctuary. We have a Guatemalan man in one of the local churches, and I'm part of the group. Many of us are part of this group, and we're helping this guy. It's just a year that he's been in the church, and it's very hard to stay inside one building for so long, but if he steps outside, he's got an ankle bracelet and he'll be picked up. So the Norwegians had a sanctuary movement, and they were concerned with the same issue of keeping people locked up in a building. They took a truck. On the back of the truck, they built a church. They created a building in the shape of the church, and they drove their sanctuary guy all over the country, and they said, you can't arrest him because he's in the church. So it was a very creative way to respond to this issue. I really loved it. We're a little afraid to try it in the United States. We don't think we'll be believed, and we don't want our guy being thrown out and back to Guatemala. I think the most immediate thing is the elections in 2 weeks, and I know we're all terribly worried about the voter suppression and the cheating and the Russians and whatever else is going to keep people from voting, but we still have to use that instrument. It's one of the things that we've got to use, and we should all be working in swing states now to get people to vote. It's really critical. And a lot of times people say young people don't vote, so working on the campuses to help get people out wherever you can. But the question that Doug asked that I want to return to was, where are we in the conflict cycle? That was the question. And one of the models that I've been using, in my years of teaching around the conflict cycle looks at a spiral of conflict and how it gets larger and larger. And one of the steps in it is the positions harden on the two sides, and I think we've hit that now in our country in a very, very deep way. And the communication stops. And there's so little communication now across the divides of red and blue voters and various other markers that separate us around social and political issues. And there's a danger in that communication stopping. And then the conflict goes outside of the community and outside of the country. And that's a surprise escalation that's happened here now, that we've got other countries involved in some very nefarious ways in our own internal politics. And there's a sense of crisis. The perceptions become distorted, which is very, very true. Our perceptions of each other across the lines of cultural identity markers, racial identity markers, et cetera, are profound. And then the sense of crisis emerges, which I think we're in now. So that's one way that I look at the conflict cycle and the rapid escalation in it. I don't think we're at the point of any kind of turning yet. I don't really know what's going to turn us around. I think that we're still very much in an escalated conflict cycle. Another model that I look at is one that talks about how people internalize and talk about why me. And we're seeing a lot of why me right now. And I think your story from California is a very good story of why me. You know, people feeling, well, I'm okay. Why are you attacking me? And I'm feeling neglected by you. And there's so much of that. And that why me, as we've seen in the white male community, shifts very often to a desire for revenge. And that desire for revenge, in our case, and this is also in this particular model, manipulation by leaders. And what are we getting now? We're getting complete manipulation by leaders. We're seeing it in so many different ways, and it stimulates that desire for revenge, accompanied by a lot of dehumanization. And you could take an analysis of any rally that the president has done in the past weeks and see this playing out right in front of our eyes. The development of a good versus evil narrative is also happening, and the ends with an act of so-called justified revenge and aggression. And pipe bombs and whatever else is going to come next is the result of that cycle. So we're trapped, and our job is to de-escalate, to see if we can pull back at any point in any step to get people away from the sense of we're falling over the cliff and it's only going to get worse.
For decades now, the diagnosis of structural violence has been assumed and part and parcel of conflict analysis and resolution. 20 years ago already, I was writing exhaustively against forgiveness in a very un-Western way, because Laura Nader preceded me. For those of you in our field who know Laura Nader, the harmony model of forgiveness. So this is not new, and I wasn't white until 1970, and then I became white. Okay, and then I went to Europe to work with conservative Christian friends who wanted to move forward but didn't want to talk about the Holocaust, and I wasn't white again. Even when I got off the train, it was clear I wasn't white. And that transformed. So some of us are shifting our colors all the time and have experienced both sides of this in our lifetimes. So the structural ways in which you're in and you're out is something that's universal. Ask a Tutsi the months before the election, when genocide became the optimal way to win the election by the Hutu majority, including killing their own Hutu liberals, which is exactly what's happening now here. There are more controls in place, but it's the same thing, that elections, which is not democracy, but a gross form of democratic competition that isn't really democracy. Rights are the core of democracy. This has happened in many places in the world. So what I'm concerned about is that those who are trying to divide progressives and rational and liberal people are succeeding mightily. And dividing and conquering is the core method of conquest and control of powerful groups. There is absolutely no difference between the importance of nonviolent resistance and power and agency achievement of the last 50 years of civil rights struggle and legal struggle, and the idea of converting those who have a great deal of privilege and who are committed to keeping their foot on the neck of someone below them. That is a universal problem in every single culture in the world. It often expresses itself through color, through lighter and darker shades of color. This is not unique to the United States. So we shouldn't be working apart from each other. The structural approaches, for example, that David talked about with reparations, those of us in the field, I've been arguing this for 30 years, that affirmative action was the wrong way to go about, sneaking in reparations. It was a disaster because we had to emotionally and psychologically acknowledge the sins of the past, not of each of us as individuals, but of the society that benefited and that still benefits. There's no disagreement on that. The question is, who should work on that, and who should, together with a common set of objectives, work on those who are poor and miserable in Kentucky and are being manipulated into the one place where they can be superior, which is to keep a black man away from the polls. That's important, because how are we going to get through to that person? How are we going to get through to somebody who is a recovering Hutu genocidal maniac? It's the same question everywhere in the world. If we do dehumanize those people, we lose them. And then they'll do it again and again and again until there's a catastrophe. And even then, you can end up like in a Somalian situation of endless war. So I think there's no disagreement about the diagnoses, but there's a misunderstanding that we have to get over between those of us who are choosing different methods of moving societies forward, and especially the human instinct of all of us to feel better off because somebody is underneath us. That's a human instinct that we all feel. You tell your kids. I told my kids when they didn't appreciate what they had, I said, look, you have your own rooms. Do you know how many kids in the world don't have their own room? And I'd say that desperately. But what I was doing is right? And so I would be encouraging them to say, oh, thank God I'm not them. We all do it. The question is how to get past that need for the other beneath my foot to my own sense of dignity, fairness, equality, and commitment to equal rights, reparations if it's appropriate, but not this facile forgiveness stuff. Everywhere I've gone in the world, the victims hate the notion of forgiveness, and rightly so. It's a whole different, and then when I tell people don't emphasize forgiveness, they say, oh, we didn't mean that. We meant equal apologies. Oh, we meant reparations too. Well, why the hell didn't you say that? Because it often is, I don't want to talk about the past, let's be forgiving, let's move on. And it's always the more powerful group that says that. And so we've written about this and written about it, but we're not talking to each other about that. There's an assumption that somehow we don't, we're on different sides. That's ridiculous. We're not on different sides. We're working different angles of the same problem. And that's what we should work together as a group.
Can I know everybody, but just, I think I know you're talking about abundance, but I think there is only so much time and space for peace builders to do some work. And so I'm wondering, this people-to-people approach, I'm more interested in really understanding the systems of oppression, of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy, and who's impacted by it, and then seeing how we can create a container of peace where those relationships can sit in. But right now, I don't think we even have a container to put that in, and that's my concern. Because we could do one person at a time, but that's going to just, take eternity. Or we can create a culture of peace that's based on a structural liberation is what's needed, and then move forward.
We have miraculously stuck to the schedule that we planned. We have half an hour for conversation with the audience. And I think this exchange was stimulating, especially at the very end there. That was right. So I want to encourage the spirit of exchange, and let's open it up. What did but have you guys? I see. Yes. Oh, we need a microphone that doesn't work. So yeah. Okay. There we go. It's for recording. Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you. Great. Okay. Good. Good.
Can you hear me? Does it work?
This is for our recording.
Oh,
so.
hence the microphone
Hence the
that doesn't
microphone.
work. Hi, my name is Francine Madden.
Can I ask you to stand up?
Oh, yes.
Just
I
so
can
that
do
they
that.
can
My
voice
butt's gonna be
projects a
in
little bit
his
better.
face. Sorry. My name's Francine Madden. I'm with the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding. And so it's going to sound a little odd, but we work on wildlife conflicts. We use wildlife globally as an entry point to address social, structural, societal conflicts. And 4 years ago, we started working on a case in the US involving wolf conflict in Washington state. And just so you know, there's relevance to what you're all doing, because if anybody remembers the Malheur Wildlife Refuge takeover by the Bundys, so there's this whole underground coordinated movement, social media network bringing together people who are anti-Semitic or white nationalist or anti-government or things like Rancher Lives Matter, et cetera, right? So that whole movement created, and is related to Ferguson, what happened in this wildlife refuge. So the connections between what's happening with wildlife conflict in the US is connected to all the things that you all care about and are working on. And in fact, a lot of these communities have started seeing wildlife and endangered wildlife in the US as a weapon of the US government against these rural communities who then voted for Trump, right, the working class communities. But I want to speak to this gentleman's point about, so I've been working with people in these communities who love Trump. And one of the things that I'm feeling as you guys are all talking is that there is a giant bubble here, and you do not have, people who voted for Trump are not all racist or anti-Semitic or white nationalist, and they care enormously, and there are containers out there. There is a container in Washington state where people are using wolves as an entry point to change some of this urban, rural, liberal, conservative bubble and try to get over the moral judgment that liberals are putting on these conservatives, and conservatives are putting it on liberals. And I just feel like there's this nobody, I don't feel like there's neutrality in this room, because I feel like it's like, oh, they're the enemy. And they're not. They're hurting, right? And they've been hurting for decades. And other groups have been hurting for hundreds of years. I get it. But the who's hurting more fight is only going to lead to more of a fight. And the fighting against the identity and attacking the identity of these groups is not going to create the receptivity for the kind of structural societal change that we need to address all the issues that you're addressing. So what you're saying about bringing in these conservatives are like, I'm just going to give you an example of a very conservative Republican legislator in Washington. Washington has maybe 3 black people in it. And it's really very white. I live in DC, so it's very, very white. And his secretary is a black woman, and she called him on, or was somebody else's secretary, it was a liberal legislator's secretary who called him on it. And he has, every single time he's doing legislation, he brings her in and he says, I need you to be my check on what we should be doing. And he's made an active effort to bring in the black woman's voice into his conservative agenda. Another Republican legislator is working with another wolf advocate, and they had built this trust and built this relationship. They're working on stuff, and she finally admits to him, she says, hey, guess what? I'm a lesbian. And he says, oh yeah, so am I, right? So, get it, he likes women, okay, good. So, but my point is that these divides can heal, and I just think we need to recognize the bubble that we are in this room, and that maybe peace builders are in, and maybe liberals are in, and all of that. We need to work. They're not the enemy, right? They're hurting too, and I get some of them. I'm done.
Yeah, I think we should respond, and then yeah.
I want to get different voices.
And then wait.
I'm forgetting a different voice.
Okay. All right. I think we'll pass the microphone around. I saw your hand up in response. So we'll do. Yeah, please.
Okay, sorry. I think a good question for us to ask is something that we also should always be asking when we're in other countries, but it's the same here. Am I from here? If I'm working here, when I go to the grocery store or the bank or the hospital, am I going to see people I live with every day and I know? And if we're not talking to those people and putting them front and center in the process, we are making a huge mistake. We're still doing colonial kind of work. And I'm uncomfortable with what's being said about Appalachia here. I live there. I live on the edge of Appalachia, and it is way more complex and way more nuanced than is often talked about. And there's a lot of positive stuff happening in that area in terms of thinking this through and working it through where people actually live together, right? So I think that's a good question for all of us to ask when we go someplace. What's my role here? Do I go to the grocery store and see my neighbor and anything I've said or done in the interest of justice or peace, I have to live with that person tomorrow?
So there's a great coherence between these two questions. I think, do you want to, on the same kind of spirit of the last comments?
So, so just a comment and a question to the panel that they can answer later. I've lived abroad for 23 years. I'm Juan, and I work at USIP. And the first thing I realized when I got back was that everybody is angry. That's why I came here, actually, to find out why. Everywhere, whether you're liberal, conservative, man, woman, gay, straight, whatever you are, you're all really angry. And you all assume a lot of things about each other. And the first thing is that people think I'm a white man. So immediately I get all sorts of discourse. And when they find out that I'm Latin, that I'm gay, that I have a brown child, that this and that, I've been around, whatever, all of a sudden they're, oh, now I can be nice to you again, right? And so I think we need to think about that. And one of the things that I could do, that was your question, is to get out the story. Whenever I tell people my story, they tend to reflect a little bit and ask questions. Why can't I get a visa for my child, right? And so I urge everybody to get your positive stories out to counter those negative narratives that are out there. Now, my question to the panel is, the other day on NPR, I was listening to a description of the political climate, the anger, the violence, and I thought they were talking about this year. And at the end of the podcast, she said that was the October 1968, right before the election, and she was describing the situation then. So my question to you is, what's different in the anger now than in 1968?
So, you know, I really appreciate this conversation because I think it's a good moment to be talking to people in the peace building field about this work. And, you know, I feel deeply strong about, you know, when Trump got elected, I had a close friend of mine, a professor who's a professor at George Mason, and he was staying with me in Brooklyn. And when Trump was elected, he didn't sleep that night. I woke up and he was crying, and he was like, you know what? I should have been working with my cousins and my uncles who wear Trump stuff and make America great again the whole time. But I didn't cry because as a black person in this country, when America catches a cold, we get pneumonia. And so when we talk about bridging the divide, you know, I think we do need to bridge the divide. I think we are working along some of the same pathways or similar pathways. And I do think at the same time, we have to put this into perspective, right? And you know, part of it is, like, I remember, you know, during Ferguson, we were like, I mean, any kind of attack like from the actual media and the world happened. Like, you know, people put our addresses online. Somebody put a close colleague of mine's address online and said, you should go rape this person. Like, these were the kinds of things that were happening. And we were trying, like lots of people were interested in supporting our work in Ferguson and around the country, like in Baltimore. And it wasn't just about police violence, obviously, it was about indignity, right? It was about, you know, this kind of generations and generations of humiliation. And so when Trump was elected and we saw the Women's March and we saw Parkland and we participated in those movements at the same time while we were like bridging the divide by working in other movements, there was so much distrust because the same people who are now Trump activated, you know, didn't really give a shit about us when we were standing there facing down the American military that our tax dollars pay for and that most Americans are complicit in this country, on our streets in American cities, which is why Palestinians hit us up and was like, yo, this looks familiar. And I'm not saying that to say like, hey, you know, I'm mad, you know, because I am mad now, and I have been mad my whole life. But I think anger is righteous, and I think we do have a right to be angry, and people have a right to be angry, and there's nothing wrong with being angry, right? And I think that, you know, I think that now is the time to be looking at things like reparations, because it's not just about money. I think it's a spiritual recognition. The things that mean the most to people in this society is money, in this room too. And like, what does it mean to remove ourselves from complicity for violence against people? How many of our retirement accounts are invested in war? How much of our clothes are invested in child, like part of what we have to do is like very personal and spiritual. We have to, each of us, unwrap ourselves from the complicity in a system of violence and industries of human misery. And for me, Ferguson was just that starting point where I just didn't give a shit anymore about caring how academic I sounded and how much I cared about like making people feel like I want to be friends. You know, like for me, Trump didn't change anything. I'm still interested in building our movements.
I think the three questions were really rich, and I want to try to respond to them all. The first woman, Trump voters are hurting terribly. That's what I was talking about primary and secondary violence. I'm sorry. I think Trump voters are hurting terribly. Arlie Hochschild is a wonderful sociologist. She wrote a very good book called Strangers in Their Own Lands. And one of her images is that people have been standing in line for generations waiting for their share of the pie. And everybody's pushing everybody else out of that line. And there's tremendous frustration on the part of everybody because people are divided and fighting for crumbs. We're not a united country where we can work together to overcome the 1% who's monopolizing everything and begin to share the tremendous amount of money that is available in this country, only it's not distributed well. So I think there is tremendous anger, and we're divided by race, by class, by geography, by religion, by so many identity markers. And rather than coming together to form a movement that really is powerful enough to develop the strategies to overcome the oligarchy, we're fighting each other. And they're picking up the prizes and the power. On the second question, my work in Appalachia has been remarkable. And I'm really glad you brought that up because I have discovered wonderfully creative, resourceful, dignified human beings who are struggling against very great odds, but are doing their best to build their communities. I've been working in an eastern Kentucky coal county where everything was owned by outsiders and taken outside the communities. There was no money left in the community. And their motto now is, we own what we make. So they're trying to localize and make sure that any funds that are generated are kept inside the community. And they're doing a beautiful job, and it's very important that we look at the attitudes and behaviors that we've had toward the Appalachian region, which is just another one of the many prejudices and stereotypes that keep this country divided. The last question that Juan asked about anger, I think it's the same anger as 1968. I was young and on the streets at that time, so I lived it personally. We had just come, that was in August when the convention happened, we had just come through the assassination of Dr. King in April and Bobby Kennedy in June. People were raw, they were bleeding, they were terrified, they felt disempowered, they felt unseen. It's the same war. It's the Civil War, it's the 1960s war, it's the war now, it's the same issues. The same divisions, exclusion, manipulation in our country that we have got to change.
Yeah. Totally agree with you about the way I analyze it in terms of we search for many, many different modes in which people can find something in common to love. So basically, it's almost a parenting model, where when people find something in common that they both love, all of the other situations are re-examined by the brain in a different way. So when you love wolves together, which sounds silly to people who are dealing with class distinctions.
Some love them, some hate them. They're divided.
So they weren't bonding over the wolves.
No, they're divided around the world.
Oh. Right, because they're the ones that, yeah, no, I get it. But there is a commonality that's being discovered through the environmental subject.
No, that was a huge division that we turned into an opportunity to bring people together.
Okay.
It's literally like saying that Israel and Palestine, their
Right.
commonality is the fact that they all.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about it, because the key is how to move people towards, basically when you attack, you're guaranteeing that a person goes into their dark brain. When you show a picture of Trump's son with a trophy from an animal, we're getting more used to hating as much as we can. And so it further divides the sides. But the key, in my opinion, is to find those things in common beyond politics that move in a new direction. The fact that this congressman was checking with somebody who was completely different and was deferring in an interesting way, we've seen that time and time again in state legislatures. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to find something in common that people both want. That having been said, I'm also on the side of nonviolent resistance theory, which is, by the way, against conflict resolution on many regards. But there are two kinds of nonviolent resistance theory. There's the Gandhian Kingian nonviolent resistance theory, and there is another kind. And the Gandhi-King model, throughout all of his writings and all of his practices, was not only to resist the structure, but to resist the structure in such a way that it was conversionary to the people who were being resisted. And we need to marry the talents of conflict resolution with that in a way that moves people in a new direction. And that's what I would argue for. As far as what Juan's point of 68, yes, it's very parallel. But again, to be unpopular, in 1968, there were millions of Cambodians that were still alive. And then they were dead because liberals in this country could not get together and realize the worst consequences of what was going to happen in that election by blowing up the convention. Because people didn't focus their priorities on the massive power and the danger of the United States and its weaponry. and what could happen if a truly diabolical president gains power. So that was a mistake because we were so angry at each other and we were not listening. And that was a mistake, and I don't think we should repeat it. I think we should look for what we have in common and move forward. That doesn't at all discount David's work, which I followed for years on reparations, which is excellent work. I'm talking about how to bring in people who are so far removed from that they're part of a process now of reversing history of the last 50, perhaps even 100 years. So these are complementary activities.
I want to talk mostly about the anger and the mad. What I found is people are mad that people are mad, that people are getting killed by police every day with impunity, that people are mad because 13,000 youth, unaccompanied minors, sit and rot in our detention centers where $4.5 billion is made by 100 nonprofit agencies that actually torture and abuse them, as you can see in many articles, psychotropic drugs. You know, people are mad that my friend Yelena, who is a Syrian American citizen, got married right before the travel ban, and she's never been able to live with her fiance, who's in Turkey, as a Syrian refugee, and she'll never be able to live with him unless she moves. Or that as I'm a Tomorrow's Peacebuilder finalist, and one of our recipients, another finalist from Yemen, was not able to come here. That's on us. Right? That's something we can do. He was not able to join us, or a Palestinian, because of the travel ban. Like, I'm mad about that, and when people are just, concerned that I'm mad because I believe you're morally corrupt, like, I don't care. I don't know what to say. Like, I mean, anger, first of all, is just a surface emotion. There's a million emotions underneath that. So we can talk about where that anger comes from individually with each person, but, okay. Like, I get mad every day. I mean, I don't know, unless we really talk about these structural issues that are killing people, are incarcerating people, that ICE is benefiting from this migrant caravan, that there's billions of dollars are being made by incarcerating black and brown bodies. Like, that gets me mad. But they're not wondering why I'm mad. They're not wondering why I'm angry. They're just mad that I'm angry. So I guess we're all angry. Do I feel like I'm morally more upright? I don't know. I really feel like we're in this crazy vortex because we could go look at the Holocaust and we could all have clear minds and hindsight 2020 and be like, oh yeah, Hitler was bad. Oh my God, we hate Hitler. Ooh, boo. But like, we can't have that conversation here. And I don't see Trump and this administration doing many different things than choosing identity, politics, and killing and incarcerating people that don't fit what is valuable in this country. That's a problem.
Can I just briefly say that, just to kind of respond a little bit. In 1968, James Foreman, who was at the time working with Fellowship of Reconciliation, he had brought a proposal to FOR around reparations. And at the time, it was a time when when people were really getting outraged about the war in Vietnam. And I'm not saying that, FOR should not have done that work, but what if we looked at our issues as connected? Like, for instance, spending less money on war and spending more money on developing the people. But also police. Like, we haven't talked about how the massive transfers of military equipment came to American police. Like, what would it mean to our partners abroad if we spent less money on war and military? And like, that doesn't necessarily negate like humanitarian aid, but I think we should be paying reparations to countries all over the world for our interventions and violence against them.
I better give this back to you.
Yeah. So there were some people who really had pressing responses, and I saw one. I'm going to ask you to, yeah, and then we're gonna close up.
Thank
after
you.
A couple more. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, well, among many things I would like really to say, one thing that I haven't heard to discuss here, and regularly in these conversations, we really like to talk the roots of, what brings us to these issues and the systemic causes, as you have mentioned, that get us in the situation of being angry, right? I think one element that I haven't heard about the anger in this country and many places is fear. And I think we can get anger from fear, or we can get angry for this humanization, be the humanized, is that the word, right? So it will be interesting to do an analysis from those two perspectives, right? Those who are angry are losing something. Some are losing, and that's the side of fear, are losing their privilege, or that they are afraid of losing privilege. And I think that's some of the reasons some people vote for Trump, and some of the reasons we are now scared of having Trump on power, right? Because there are ways to lose privilege, there are ways to lose certain things that have been gained in terms of being comfortable, and but some others are angry because we have been dehumanized, right? And those are huge differences, because from those two perspectives, we can act differently also, and look either for the ways to resolve that, continuing being angry and aggressive and violent in different ways, not just physically, but like economic violence is one of those, or continue being organized and resilient and propositive, as many of us have been when talk about being peace builders. So I will propose to consider those two perspectives when we are discussing this issue of anger, and but also looking from the roots that generate that anger. I'm sorry, that's a hard word for me, to be mad, to be, muy, con mucha rabia. So finally, I would like to say that part of that, and I'm very glad that you pointed it out, part of that is to look at also the culture of this country in terms of his tendency to militarization instead of a tendency to human security, which will be so much different, right? So when we talk about creative, maybe we have to be switching to think about human security, and to also articulate things, right? Kind of come together. There is people I cannot come together really, and I have to be honest about that. But definitely there are points that we can connect dots, we can connect struggles, we can connect efforts, and that's something we are also not doing, right? Everything is pulling us apart, right? Keeping us kind of separated. At some point, we have to find the ways to articulate with each other, to get together with each other and put together forces, because definitely by myself I cannot do it.
And on this, I hear everybody is going off. Monica, you had a closing that actually speaks to resilience, bringing us together and avoiding fear. So I'm going to use this as a transition.
Yeah, so Monica and I are going to do just a little closing together. I'm going to do a little piece, and then she will. And I'd like to ask you if you're comfortable to sit back. Ask you if you're comfortable to speak back, sit back and relax and close your eyes. Just see if you feel comfortable just to close your eyes for a few minutes. Take a couple of deep breaths in and out. Just check your feelings, what you're feeling after this morning of first of dignity and then of this panel. what comes to you around any feelings of gratitude, any feelings of appreciation for being here, for each other, for this particular community convening right now? And then ask yourself the question, where am I in all of this? What's my role? Where's my heart leading me? How can I best serve? How do I express my compassion and my empathy for all the people in our country and our world who are caught up in the same drama, the drama of our time, our moment?
Just to continue, keep your eyes closed if you want. And I just want to think about our feet planted on the ground. And if we can imagine roots coming out, and I want you to think of everything that keeps you rooted, your ancestors, your people, maybe the story of migration that brought you to this place, your values. And then I want you to think about your hands as instruments of peace, and who you touch, and who you reach out to, and who you decide to show up like hope for. And then finally, our eyes. Just to leave with the hope to see the unseen, and to make visible what's not visible. Thank you very much.